Richard Cerruti was watching a backhoe scrape open a hillside for a freeway when he saw a bone in the wall. That was November 1992, San Diego County. Under 4 meters of silt sat a broken mastodon and heavy stones that had no business being there. The bone was too old for radiocarbon dating, so it went into a museum storage box, and it sat there for 22 years. Then someone finally dated it, 130,000 years. 10 times older than any human was ever supposed to be on that continent. And within 48 hours of publication, the field went to work trying to take it apart. A boring job until it wasn't. Cerruti was a field paleontologist working for the San Diego Natural History Museum. His job that month was boring in the way good jobs often are. State Route 54 was being widened, machines were cutting into the hillside, and he watched the exposed cut faces for fossils. That was essentially it. Then a grader sliced a fresh layer out of the bank, and something pale surfaced in the silt. He stopped the work. Southern California has always been strange territory for this kind of work. The region sits on layer after layer of ancient sediment laid down over millions of years by rivers, floods, and shifting coastlines, and construction crews across the county regularly run into fossils of mammoths, ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats buried just beneath the surface. Most of those discoveries are routine. A paleontological monitor logs the find, catalogs it, and the road crew moves on within a day or two. Nobody expected November 1992 to be any different. That's actually a real decision worth pausing on. Telling a highway construction crew to hold everything while you personally examine a bone takes some nerve. He looked. Fossil bone, roughly 4 meters down, sitting in fine-grained sediment that had been laid down slowly by water over time. Old, interesting, nothing that should keep anyone up at night on its own. Then he called for the museum's curator of paleontology, Thomas Desmarais. And a little later they called in someone who specifically studies stone tools. That's a genuinely strange phone call to make about a mastodon. What came out of the ground? The excavation ran for about 5 months. It was slow, careful, badly funded, and it produced around 300 individual specimens, bones, teeth, tusk fragments. And the more they cleared away, the stranger the overall picture got. 2 femur heads, the rounded ball ends of the thigh bones, were sitting there completely unbroken, resting close together. Almost everything else around them had been smashed apart. Nearby lay cobbles, several of them, made of andesite and other hard stone, some weighing several kilograms, sitting directly in fine silt, exactly where cobbles do not simply arrive on their own. Rivers that carry and drop heavy cobbles also carry and drop gravel and sand alongside them. This particular layer was pure mud. So how does a 5-kilogram rock end up sitting in mud right next to a shattered mastodon with the 2 roundest, densest bones in the entire animal left carefully, deliberately intact? There was more still. The breaks were spiral fractures, the specific kind you get when bone snaps while it's still fresh and greasy, not dry and fully mineralized. And when the team laid all the fragments out on a table, some of the bone flakes actually fit right back onto their parent bone. They refit perfectly. That sounds like a small technical detail, but it isn't. A flake that refits means the bone broke exactly there in that spot, and the resulting pieces never traveled anywhere afterward. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding a fingerprint still sitting on the glass. The overall picture the evidence was describing was blunt and specific. Somebody had apparently placed a mastodon femur on a stone anvil and struck it with a hammerstone, which is exactly what people do when they're after marrow. Why it didn't explode in 1993, here's where this whole story should have exploded immediately, back in 1993. It didn't, simply because they couldn't date it. Radiocarbon dating needs collagen to work, and this particular bone had almost none left. Every single attempt failed, which already told the researchers something uncomfortable. Failed radiocarbon usually means you've moved past the method's practical reach, somewhere beyond roughly 50,000 years. But beyond 50,000 years isn't a number you casually take to a journal when your entire discipline has already agreed that nobody was in the Americas before about 13,000 years ago. So the boxes went into museum storage, labeled, cataloged, and shelved away. For 22 years, potentially the most explosive site in North American archaeology sat quietly inside a drawer. Then, around 2014, James Paces of the U.S. Geological Survey ran uranium-thorium dating on the bone. The underlying idea is fairly simple. Uranium slowly seeps into buried bone from surrounding groundwater and starts decaying on a fixed, predictable clock. Measure the resulting daughter products, and you get an age. The number came back at roughly 130,700 years, give or take about 9,400 years. They ran it again. Same window, essentially unchanged. That's not a date that gently adjusts an existing model. That's a date that sets the whole thing on fire. It would place somebody breaking mastodon bones in Southern California while Neanderthals still walked across Europe, and while modern humans hadn't even left Africa yet in any meaningful numbers. Publication? Then demolition. The team published their findings in Nature in April 2017. Stephen Holin, Demire, Passes, Carudi, and others listed as authors, and the response wasn't really a debate. It was closer to a demolition. Within days, the biggest names in the field were already on the record. Gary Haynes, Donald Grayson, David Meltzer, Vance Holliday, Michael Waters, and the objections weren't vague hand-waving either. They were surgical. No stone tools anywhere at the site, not one recognizable shaped artifact, no cut marks, no human bone, no hearth, nothing you could hold up in your hand and confidently say, "This was made by someone." And then came the objection that actually stings the most. The site sat inside an active road cut. There were heavy machines working just meters away at the time of discovery. In 2018, a team led by Joseph Ferraro published a direct comparison showing that construction equipment can break fossil bone in ways that look strikingly similar to deliberate human percussion. I want to be honest with you here, because the honesty really is the story. That particular criticism is good. It's genuinely the correct question to ask. A hillside being actively carved open by a grader is about the worst possible place imaginable to argue that stone struck bones 100,000 years earlier. The original team's answer was that the cobbles were sitting in an undisturbed position, inside a layer where they simply couldn't naturally occur, complete with impact scars, and that the refitting flakes showed breakage happening right there on site, not later, and not caused by a machine that had only arrived on the scene in 1992. Both sides were making a genuinely real argument. Only one of them was ultimately going to be allowed to look reasonable in the eyes of the field. Understanding the field's scar tissue. To understand why the reaction was that fast and that total, you have to understand exactly what this field had already survived leading up to that moment. For most of the 20th century, researchers connected to the Smithsonian spent entire careers systematically knocking down early American claims, one after another. And for the most part, they were right to. The Americas had attracted bad archaeology like almost nowhere else on Earth. Misread geology, natural rocks mistakenly called tools, and outright hoaxes scattered throughout the record. A discipline that gets burned that many times eventually builds up real antibodies against new claims. Then, in 1927, near Folsom, New Mexico, a stone spear point was found still lodged directly inside the ribs of an extinct species of bison. Nobody could reasonably argue with that. The old wall broke. A new one went up almost immediately in its place, built around a site at Blackwater Draw and named after nearby Clovis, New Mexico. And it said, roughly 13,000 years, no earlier, one single migration through a corridor in the retreating ice. That model wasn't stupid. It was built from the best evidence anyone actually had at the time, but it gradually hardened into something else entirely. Just ask Louis Leakey. In the 1960s and 1970s, Leakey, arguably the most famous name connected to human origins research anywhere on Earth, backed a California site called Calico, with claimed ages around 200,000 years. The field rejected the recovered objects as geofacts, naturally broken rock. It cost him dearly. The very man who had helped rewrite African prehistory ended his own career being quietly described by colleagues as having lost his judgment out in the Mojave. Nobody needed an actual conspiracy after that. The lesson had already been learned by everyone watching. Early dates and careers. 30 years. Defending one deposit, which brings us to James Adovazio and a rock shelter in Pennsylvania that ended up swallowing 30 years of his working life. Adovazio started digging at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter back in 1973. It's a textbook excavation, obsessively recorded layer by layer, genuinely one of the most carefully documented digs anywhere in North America. And the deepest levels produced radiocarbon dates running past 16,000 years. Some samples went deeper still. The objection arrived fast. Contamination. There's coal deposits in that region, and particulate carbon from ancient coal can potentially wash into sediments and drag a radiocarbon date artificially older than it really should be. Critics also noted that the plant and animal remains recovered looked somewhat too temperate for a site sitting that close to an ice sheet at the time. These were fair questions to raise. Adovazio answered them the only real way you can. He dated the site again and again. Dozens of separate determinations, all running in perfectly correct stratigraphic order. Younger material on top, older material below, with no scrambling and no sign whatsoever of the contaminant carbon anybody had proposed. Same answer every single time. Tested again. Same answer again. That consistency was actually the real problem here, because a clean, orderly sequence of dates is genuinely hard to explain away with contamination alone. And the alternative, simply accepting it, meant the whole accepted map was wrong. So the argument simply never fully ended. Adovazio spent decades defending one single deposit. He wasn't really defending a number on a page. He was defending the underlying idea that the accepted map itself could be wrong. And within the profession, that's not really treated as a scientific position. It functions more like a professional liability. A child's footprint in a Chilean bog. The wall didn't ultimately break in Pennsylvania. It broke inside a peat bog at the opposite end of the hemisphere. Monteverde sits in southern Chile, and Tom Dillahay began working the site in 1977. What eventually came out of that bog wasn't ambiguous chipped stone open to interpretation. Peat genuinely preserves things that normally rot away. There were wooden stakes, lengths of cordage, pieces of preserved hide, plant remains including seaweed carried up from a coastline more than 50 kilometers away. The remnants of an actual structure, and pressed into hardened clay, a footprint. Small, a child's. The age came back at around 14,500 years. That's not just older than Clovis. It's roughly 15,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait, sitting at the far southern end of 2 entire continents, which means people had to have entered the Americas long before that point, just to have walked all the way down there in the first place. For 20 years, the site was fought over relentlessly. Then, in January 1997, a group of archaeologists, including some of the loudest skeptics working in the field at the time, flew directly to Chile and walked the site themselves in person. They examined the sediments, the wooden stakes, the stratigraphy. They accepted it as genuine. That's supposed to be the happy ending to this particular story. It isn't, quite. Objections kept coming afterward from researchers who hadn't personally been on that original trip. And Dillahay's even deeper layer at Monteverde, containing far older material, is still rejected by nearly everyone working in the field today. 20 years of one man's working life, and an entire panel of colleagues standing physically in a Chilean bog, all just to finally be believed about a single child's footprint, a sinkhole that waited 30 years. And while that particular fight was still running, a site in Florida that had already been dismissed once was quietly sitting under a river, waiting for its own turn. Page Ladson is a sinkhole located in the Osceola River, and to excavate it, you have to dive through black water with almost no visibility at all, with divers working the sediment entirely by feel, using dredge hoses to clear material away. In the 1980s and 1990s, that earlier work produced a mastodon tusk showing what looked like cut marks, long parallel grooves consistent with someone deliberately cutting the tusk free from the skull to access it. The dates that came back at the time seemed too old to be credible, and the site was largely written off by the field. Then, decades later, Jesse Halligan and Michael Waters went back down into that same sinkhole. New excavation, new samples, tighter stratigraphy. They published their results in 2016. The occupation dated to about 14,950 years. And this time, they also had a stone biface, unambiguously shaped by a human hand, sealed directly within the same sediment deposit. Now here's the part that genuinely reframes everything you've heard so far in this story. Michael Waters is one of the sharpest, most persistent critics of the San Diego Mastodon claim. He's exactly the kind of specialist who publicly took that 130,000-year date apart piece by piece, and he's also the very reason Page Ladson is now widely accepted, which tells you that the skepticism in this field actually does work, eventually. It also tells you exactly what that skepticism costs. 30 years, with a genuinely correct site sitting quietly under a river the entire time, treated as a mistake, until someone with the right professional reputation finally went back and properly reproved it. The critics in this field aren't really a solid wall. They're more like a very slow door, and people spend entire careers standing outside it, waiting. When the debate became an image. Up to this point, every single one of these arguments has revolved around things a general audience genuinely cannot see for themselves. Molecules, sediment chemistry, whether a particular flake technically counts as a flake or not. Then, New Mexico turned the entire debate into something visual. In the Tularosa Basin at White Sands, inside the dried bed of an ancient lake, there are human footprints. Not just one or two of them. Entire trackways, hundreds of individual prints, gradually exposed by wind, originally printed into soft mud that later hardened and was buried for thousands of years. And these aren't abstract data points. One trail clearly records an adult walking briskly across wet ground, repeatedly setting down and then picking back up a small child. You can actually see exactly where the child's feet touch the mud and where they don't. Another trail crosses directly over the tracks of a giant ground sloth, and the sloth's own path visibly swerves in response. A mammoth trackway runs straight through a set of human prints nearby. You're genuinely looking at one specific afternoon from thousands of years ago. Somebody carrying a small child past animals that have now been completely extinct for 11,000 years. 3 methods, 1 answer. The dating team, publishing in 2021, radiocarbon dated seeds from an aquatic plant found directly within the track layers themselves. The result, roughly 23,000 to 21,000 years ago. That isn't a small adjustment to the accepted timeline. At 21,000 years ago, the ice sheets were sitting at their absolute maximum extent. The migration route everybody had confidently drawn on the map, the corridor running through the ice, simply didn't exist yet at that point. A footprint isn't quite like an ordinary artifact either. Artifacts can slide, wash downhill, get redeposited somewhere else entirely. A footprint is a specific person standing in one exact place at one exact moment, and it genuinely cannot move afterward. The objection arrived within months, and it was a genuinely real one. Those seeds came from an aquatic plant. Aquatic plants can absorb dissolved carbon from old groundwater, a known issue called the hard water reservoir effect, and come out reading far older than they actually are. If that effect was happening at White Sands, the footprints could genuinely be thousands of years younger than claimed. That objection alone could have killed the entire finding. It sounded genuinely decisive. So the researchers tested it to death. In 2023, the team came back armed with 2 completely independent dating clocks. 3 completely different methods. One consistent answer. Later work added even further independent age control on top of that, some of it involving researchers who had personally raised the original doubts in the first place. That's really science functioning exactly as it's supposed to. And it took a genuine mountain of sustained effort just to properly defend what was, at its core, literally just a set of footprints. A bridge that opened too late. Now the accepted map has a real problem because in 2016, sedimentary DNA work conducted on the ice-free corridor, the passage running between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, the exact highway every single textbook had confidently drawn, revealed something genuinely awkward. The corridor became open as bare ground long before it was actually survivable for anyone traveling through it. No bison, no available forage, nothing meaningful to hunt or eat along the way. It only became biologically viable somewhere around 12,600 years ago. Read that again carefully. The exact route people supposedly used to first arrive only became usable after Clovis already existed. The bridge effectively appeared after the footprints were already sitting on the other side of it. So people clearly came another way instead, and the evidence for that alternate route has been quietly accumulating in places nobody was really looking closely before, following a different route. At Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, Lauren Davis has been excavating a site with dates around 16,000 years old, with genuine arguments for even older material underneath. The stone points recovered there are what's called Western stemmed, a distinctly different technology from Clovis, with possible parallels reaching across to the Northwest Pacific region. Off the coast of California, on Santa Rosa Island, human remains known as Arlington Springs Man date to roughly 13,000 years old. And that particular island was never connected to the mainland, not at any sea level throughout the entire Ice Age, which means somebody had to cross open water just to get there. That single fact quietly demolishes an assumption that had been buried underneath a century of argument, the assumption that the first Americans traveled entirely on foot. And then there's the very edge of the current map. Chiquihuite Cave in northern Mexico is where a team led by Cyprian Ardeline published a claim for stone tools dating back around 30,000 years. Most specialists reject this claim outright. They believe the recovered objects are geofacts, naturally fractured limestone rather than genuine tools. That's genuinely where the scientific consensus currently sits, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise here. But notice carefully what has actually changed around it. 20 years ago, a claim like that would have been essentially unpublishable in any major journal. Now it gets into Nature and gets seriously argued about on its actual merits. The old confidence that made such claims unthinkable in the first place is simply gone now. Missing evidence, not proof of absence. And if people really were moving steadily down along a coastline during this period, the strongest evidence for it likely isn't sitting in the desert at all. It's underwater. At the absolute peak of the last glaciation, global sea level sat about 120 meters lower than it does today. Every beach, every estuary, every river mouth, and every ancient campsite along that entire Pacific margin is now sitting somewhere on the modern seabed. The single most likely migration route into 2 entire continents may be exactly the one place archaeologists have barely been able to properly excavate at all. Missing evidence isn't proof of anything on its own. But an absence of evidence in a place nobody can realistically dig isn't evidence of absence either. What the genetics won't explain, then the genetics started saying genuinely strange things too. In Alaska, the remains of an infant recovered from upward Sun River turned out to belong to a distinct population branch, now called the ancient Beringians, that split off from other Native American ancestors far earlier than the tidy single-wave migration story ever allowed for. A group that apparently sat isolated in the north for a very long stretch of time, well before anyone was supposedly there at all. And there's one particular result nobody has fully explained yet. Several indigenous groups in the Amazon, including the Surui and the Cartiana, carry a faint genetic signal that's actually closer to Australasian populations than to any other Native American group. It's small. It's genuinely real. It has been independently replicated in multiple studies, and there's currently no accepted explanation for how it got there at all. That particular finding isn't evidence for a 130,000-year-old mastodon site. It has nothing directly to do with San Diego whatsoever. but it's a published, peer-reviewed anomaly sitting right in the middle of the human family tree. And the honest answer, for now, is that nobody fully knows what it actually means. A retreat. Nobody announced. Meanwhile, the old model simply went quiet over time. There was no press conference held, no formal apology issued, no paper published with a title like "We Were Wrong About Meadowcroft." What actually happened instead was slower and much harder to notice happening in real time. Museum labels quietly softened their wording. Textbook phrasing shifted gradually from the first Americans to the earliest widespread culture instead. Migration maps grew a second arrow, drawn along the coastline, noticeably thinner than the original inland one. New papers stopped bothering to argue for pre-Clovis presence at all, and simply assumed it going forward, the same way you'd casually assume gravity exists without needing to prove it each time. The field didn't really lose this argument outright. It simply adjusted quietly over time, and it never really went back to properly explain why the people who had been right all along were made to spend 20 or 30 years being treated as professionally unreliable for saying so. Back to the drawer, which brings me back to a drawer sitting in San Diego. The two femur heads are still there. So are the cobbles. So are the storage boxes Cerruti originally filled back in 1993. And I have to give you the flat, honest truth about all of it. The 130,000-year claim is not currently accepted by the field. Most specialists genuinely believe heavy construction equipment is the better, more likely explanation, and their underlying reasons are strong ones. There are no recognizable stone tools, no cut marks, no human remains, nothing that clearly says made rather than simply broken. It may honestly just be wrong. If you take one single thing away from this whole story, take that. But then take a second thing, too, because it's really the one that actually keeps me up at night. Meadowcroft was called contaminated. It wasn't. Monteverde was called flatly impossible. It wasn't. Page Ladson was written off for 30 straight years and then eventually vindicated by one of its own original doubters. White Sands was supposed to be killed off by a reservoir effect that 3 completely independent dating methods then quietly buried for good. Every single time, the field initially said, not possible. And every single time it eventually quietly said, fine, instead, years late, and without ever really accounting for the time it had cost the people who had originally carried the evidence forward. So no, this really isn't a story about some hidden conspiracy. Nobody deliberately hid anything from anyone. It's something more ordinary than that, and honestly, more corrosive in the long run. A discipline so genuinely scarred by decades of bad claims that doubt itself became the safe career move. And being right too early became almost indistinguishable from simply being reckless. The mastodon may ultimately be nothing at all. A greater, one unlucky afternoon, an unfortunate coincidence involving some stones, but it sits inside that drawer, permanently unexcavated further because the rest of the original deposit is already gone. They poured the freeway directly over it. 4 lanes of State Route 54 now run across the part they never got the chance to properly dig, carrying traffic at speed all day, every single day. Whatever the real answer actually was, it's sitting somewhere underneath the asphalt now. What would actually change the verdict? If there's a genuine path forward for this particular claim, it likely doesn't run through San Diego at all anymore, since that ground is gone for good. It runs through finding something comparable elsewhere. A second site, independently dated to a similarly extreme age, showing the same selective pattern of bone destruction alongside similarly modified stone, would go a long way toward turning Cerruti from an isolated curiosity into the first confirmed example of a much larger, currently invisible pattern. So far, nothing like that has turned up anywhere else in North America, and that absence genuinely cuts both ways in the ongoing debate. Skeptics take it as further confirmation that Cerruti is simply an unfortunate anomaly. Supporters argue that a small, short-lived population passing briefly through an unfamiliar continent before eventually vanishing without descendants would naturally leave behind only a thin, easily missed trace, precisely because there was never a large, sustained population there in the first place. Until that kind of corroborating discovery actually happens somewhere else, Cerruti will likely keep sitting exactly where it has sat for the past several years. Acknowledged, argued over, unresolved, and quietly filed as the single most extreme claim currently on the table in the story of the first Americans.